Now, the second video that I want to do today for you guys is to talk about the dimensions. So there were a few people who asked about the actual dimensions. I'm taking this opportunity to bring you the dimensions for the new Explorer 40 as well as the Explorer 36. And just like I was mentioning in my previous video, this is not actually 40 millimeters, and this is not actually 36 millimeters. So without any further ado, I have my trusty calipers here. I use this professional grade plastic calipers to avoid scratching the watch. You can use any calipers. The important thing is that you know how to read the vernier scale on the calipers. I noticed online two situations. One situation is where the person doing the review just reads from the press release and they just spew out the same bullshit measurements that the brand gives. So they're going to go and they're going to say, the new Explorer 40 is a 40 millimeter watch by blah, 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 by blah, blah, blah. But they don't actually measure it. And that's just lazy reporting because this is not actually a 40 millimeter case, as you'll see, nor is the 36 a 36 millimeter case, as you'll see. And the other thing is someone does have a calipers, and either it's a digital calipers that's poorly calibrated, or it's a normal engineering calipers like this, but they don't know how to properly read the vernier scale and they give you the wrong measurement. And actually, there is a third thing that I see, which is a lot of people take the watch and they measure it like this. They measure it like this, right? So the first thing that's wrong with this type of measurement from uh, a diagonal, right? From 8 o'clock to 2 o'clock or from 10 o'clock to, is that without even realizing, you're actually catching a bit of the lug. And you don't even have to catch a lot of the lug to affect your measurement. Depending on the case, you may look like this case here. When you look at it, you could almost be fooled into thinking that if you measure it like this, it's going to give out the same measurement, but it's not. The reality is that because of the crown, it's very hard to get a true horizontal measurement. But what you need to do is you need to actually look at the watch like this, and what you can see is that the width of the actual watch is equal to the width of the bezel, because the case doesn't protrude outside of the bezel. In fact, if you look really closely, you'll see that the very edge of the bezel is actually the outermost point of the watch. So then it's a lot easier to actually measure the watch just by measuring the bezel. Now, even if you're just measuring the bezel, what you need to pay attention to is to get a true measurement. So you see most calipers have like these reference points. So this way you know whether or not you're holding it in the correct position. With a round bezel like this, you want to be measuring it correctly so that you're measuring it at the outermost point, not somewhere in the middle. Conversely, you can rest the case on the inside of the calipers, and that's when you know, okay, now it's impossible for me to make a mistake. So if we look here, you guys can see that this particular case is actually 30. Let me see if I got the correct positioning here, just to be absolutely certain that I'm not doing anything wrong. So you go 35, 36, 37, 38, and then when you look at the vernier scale on the calipers, it's somewhere between 38.2, 38.3, something like that. You see? It's a lot harder to do this when when I'm filming, but because I'm actually looking at the image on the camera. But I did this earlier, and it's almost exactly 38.3 millimeters. So this is effectively a 38.2, 38.3 millimeter watch. It's not 40, it's not 39. It's actually, if anything, it's closer to 38, right? It doesn't make any sense to say that this is a 40 millimeter watch, and all of the ladies and gentlemen on the internet who go on to say, oh, this is too big, blah, 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 blah. It's not too big. So now, if I'm reading the scale, it's 38.4. Yeah, so depending on how you're holding it, but and you know the level of adjustment that you use, you can get slightly different measurements. For example, if you measure it like this is going to give you a slightly smaller measurement because the beak of the calipers goes a little bit under the bezel, right? So if you measure it like this on the very beak of the caliper, now it's 38.15. 38.15. But the correct way where you actually get the actual maximum bezel width is like this, and then it's 38 point, trying to see which one lines up better, 38.4. Yeah, 38.4. So 38 millimeters 0.4 is the true size of the Rolex Explorer 40. 38.4. If you get it with the beak, it goes to 38.2. If you get it with in the proper position, it's 38.4. This is why everyone who says, oh, this watch is too big, they're actually thinking that it's 40. And judging by the way it looks on my wrist, I agree. If this watch was actually 40, so 2 millimeters bigger, it would be too big of a watch. For this type of watch, 40 millimeters, it's kind of, you have to be a giant to pull it off. And guess what? This is the same case that's used on the Datejust 41. This is the same case that's used on the OP41, only the bezel is different. So the bezel is flat, but it doesn't have the same edge on the Datejust. It has a more rounded edge, and on the OP is actually domed. So the bezel is slightly different, but the case is the same. So what you're seeing here on this calipers applies to those watches. So the Rolex Oyster Perpetual 41 is not a 41 millimeter watch. It's a 38.4 millimeter watch. Rolex Datejust 41, again, it's not a 41 millimeter watch. It's a 38.4, depending on how they finished the bezel slightly differently, you might get 38.5, 38.4, 38.3, something like that. But it's the same. Overall, it's the same case, and overall, it's the same, a very similar case size. So it's not a 40 or 41 millimeter watch. It's a 38 millimeter watch. If it was a 40 or 41 true, it would be huge. It would be too big. Now let's talk a little bit about this little guy. Same thing here. If you look at the case sides of the 36 are the same. So the widest point is actually the very tip, the sharp edge of the bezel. And I could already tell just without, I didn't even have a calipers with me, just by putting it on my wrist, I could tell that this watch was not a 36 millimeter watch. I could tell that it's not a 36 millimeter watch just by placing it on my wrist. And then once I finally got a caliper and measured it, guess what? Let's do the same. Let's look really closely. So as you can see, it's not even 35. It's slightly below 35. I'm going to go on the vernier scale and see which lines up perfectly, and it's between 34.6 and 34.7. 34.7. So this is a 34.7 millimeter watch, effectively. They call it the Explorer 36, but it's a 34.7 millimeter watch. And that's why a lot of people, when they put it on their wrist the first time, they go like, oh my God, this is too small. It's not too small. You can even see it on my wrist. My wrist, it's an average size between 16.5 to 17 centimeter. It doesn't look too small. It's not too small, but I get it. I get why some people, like if you're used to a bigger watch, when you first put this on your wrist, it looks a little bit small. In fact, the camera makes it look a little bit bigger. With your natural human vision, it will look even smaller than this, but it's not too small at all. And it's only the visual perspective, it's only in comparison to other watches. So yeah, if you wear a Submariner and you take the Submariner off and you put this watch on, it's going to look absolutely tiny. Not because it's a tiny watch or because it's too small for your wrist, it isn't, but just by comparison. Your brain and your eyes have adapted to that visual image of the Submariner on your wrist. When you put this on, of course, it's tiny by comparison. That is a 40.5 millimeter watch. This is a 34.7. So it's almost 6 millimeter difference. It's like comparing a 40 millimeter watch to a 46 millimeter watch. It's like comparing, it's like comparing a Submariner to a G-Shock or something like that. It looks tiny by comparison, right? But it's not too small of a watch. However, one thing that I would like to point out about this particular watch is that it's clear that when Rolex released this, they knew that this was coming. There are certain proportions about it which make me feel like, even though it's clearly a unisex watch, so I would never say that this is a lady's watch, but it's clear that they knew that this was coming because when the Explorer was only available in 36 millimeters, it had certain features about it that made it more masculine. It made it wear bigger than its actual size was. So first thing is that it was actually 36, not 34.7, right? So that's the first thing. And you may think that it's not a lot, but in reality, it is kind of a lot. It's kind of like the difference between the Oyster Perpetual 34 and the Oyster Perpetual 36. It's not a lot on paper, but when you actually put the watch on your wrist, you can definitely see a difference. The second thing is that it had a squarer case. So the old 114 references, whether we're talking Oyster Perpetual, whether we're talking 114 dates, whether we're talking 116 Datejusts, they had a squarer case with a little bit of a less curvaceous profile, but more square with a little bit wider lugs. So the overall stance of the case was more muscular. Like even if you compare a Datejust, which a Datejust is slightly bigger than this, it's closer to actually 36 millimeters. Or even if you compare an Oyster Perpetual, where an Oyster Perpetual 36 is actually closer to 36 millimeters. It's a little bit bigger than this. Even if you compare those watches, the 124 or 126 reference versions versus the previous 114, 116 references, you will see that the newer 124, 126 are smaller. They're slimmer, they're more curvaceous, they're rounder, less square, less muscular. The second thing that contributes to this is the bracelet. So the 114 Explorer, and I think almost all of the references going back to the 1016 and even before that, they had 20 millimeter bracelet widths at the lugs. 20. This is 19. Again, you may think, oh, 19 versus 20, it's not a big difference. It is. It is a big difference. It makes the watch's stance on the wrist wider. Also, the taper. Like the taper on this particular bracelet is super dramatic. It's like it's already narrow here from 19, but look how much it tapers down. Like here, it's 14, and the clasp is 16, because the clasp is a little bit wider. So the bracelet taper is 5 millimeters. Before, on the 114 references, it was 4 millimeters, the taper, right? That was still a nice taper, but it wasn't as dramatic as this. And it didn't result in such a narrow clasp. Like just look, if I compare the clasp of the 40 millimeter versus the clasp of the 36 millimeter, it's huge. Like this looks like almost double. It's not double, but it's the difference is huge, you know? So these are the reasons why when you look at the new 124 reference Explorer 36, it looks smaller. And to me, while I still consider it a unisex watch, but it does indicate the fact that when Rolex was developing this and when they were building this, they knew that this was coming. They knew that this was in the pipeline. Because if they didn't already have this one, the bigger one in the pipeline, they wouldn't have made this one as small. Like if their plan was to release just one and have it completely unisex, and just one option for both ladies as well as gentlemen, they would have made this probably closer to the 114 dimensions. So it would have been 36, not 34.7. It would have had a 20 millimeter bracelet, not a 19 millimeter bracelet, and it would have had a less dramatic taper down to probably a 16 millimeter clasp, right? So just 4 millimeters of taper instead of 5 millimeters of taper. So all of these details tell me that Rolex knew exactly what they were doing, and when they did this watch, they intentionally made it a little bit smaller because they knew this was coming, and it wouldn't have made sense to make such close together. Like if this was a true 36 and we know that this is a 38, they would have been too close together. They would have been like, it makes no sense. If you're just making two watches, it makes no sense to make them so close together. 136, 138. You make them 36, 40, right? If you're making just two. If you want to make three, you can do 36, 40, and a 38 in between. But again, this is too much. I mean, I got this in the comments. There was a gentleman saying like, they should have made it 38 and 38 would have been perfect. And then when I was doing the video about the Blancpain 50 Fathoms, that is 38. That's listed as 38.2, but actually measuring it with my calipers, it's 38.1. And people were like, oh, it should have been 40. 40 would have been the perfect. So it seems like whatever you do, you will not please everyone. Like if you make it 36 and 40 like this, people are saying, oh, it should have been 38. And if you make it 38, then people go like, oh, it should have been 40. The good news is for everybody out there watching is that this is actually 38. So this is actually the watch that everybody wants and that everybody's asking for. This is not a 40 millimeter watch. And I agree with everybody, but they're talking just from seeing it in the pictures and just from reading countless mindless reviews online where watch media so-called journalists just spew out the press release and they go, this is a 40 millimeter watch and it's got a 47, 48 millimeter lug to lug and it's got a 12 millimeter, height and blah, blah, blah. No, it doesn't. If you actually measure it, this is actually smaller in almost, and then they go to say, I preferred it when it was the Explorer 39. 39 was a better, for this type of watch that doesn't have a functional bezel, 39 was a more appropriate size. This is actually smaller than the 39 in all dimensions. So that watch has had a 47 millimeter lug to lug. This is 46.5. That watch was 38.7. This is 38.4. And that watch was 11.7 if I remember correctly, and this is 11.4, 11.5. So in every dimension, this watch is smaller than that watch. But that's what happens when you have unreliable watch reporting from people who call themselves journalists, but they're anything but. And instead of actual reporting, they only do access journalism. You end up with a skewed public image where a lot of people believe that this watch is too big. A lot of people believe that this watch is actually bigger than the previous one. And I know that this kind of went from an informative video to a bit of a rant, but this is kind of the whole reason why I started Mindful Horology and why I started my channel, is because I'm just tired of these shenanigans, and I'm being polite when I'm calling them shenanigans. I remember I was reading Hodinkee when the new Oyster Perpetuals came out, and at the time I had a previous version, Oyster Perpetual 39, and I remember that I went on Hodinkee. Mr. Stephen P. had just written a beautiful article where he was saying that the white dial Oyster Perpetual 39 was his favorite modern Rolex of all time. You know, it was a node to that watch. And then he was doing also the article where he was announcing the new Oyster Perpetuals. And he was citing the dimensions, and he was saying the old one was 39 and the new one is 41 and blah blah blah, just basically exactly what it says on the Rolex website. And I went in the comments, like I don't usually comment, very rarely I left a comment in the, but that really pissed me off. And I remember writing in the comments and telling Mr. Pulverant, I think it's his name, I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing it in a wrong way, Stephen Pulverant. And I told him, sorry to bother you, but the dimensions are not exactly, what Rolex claims they are. First of all, these two watches are almost identical in size. There's no 2mm upsizing. Second of all, they're not actually 39 and 41. They're both more like 38. Because I already had the black and the white Oyster Perpetual 39. And of course, the first thing that I did when those watches were released, I went to my ID, and when they got them in, I was able to compare them. And I could immediately tell that just like the 39 was not a 39 but the 38 point something, so too the 41 was not a 41 but the same 38 point something. And just like the Explorer 40 is actually shorter and less wide than the 39, so too the new Oyster Perpetuals, the 124s, were actually smaller than the outgoing 114s, 116, and yeah, it just pisses me off to see this lazy reporting where, it's so easy. Like we were talking earlier about the screwdrivers and how inexpensive they are. This is like even less expensive than that. This, you can go to your local, tool store or whatever, and you can get this for $2, maybe even less. And it's so easy to learn how to read the vernier scale and actually do measurements. And if you say this watch is this dimension, you actually saying because you measured it, not just because you're spitting out the press release where they're giving out rounded up numbers. And Rolex does this for various reasons. First of all, what I personally think that The main reason why they do this rounding up is because they like to keep things simple. Like, you're never going to see on Rolex's website something like 23.21, like laser accurate measurements. You're never going to see that. They always like to round up, and if something is 40 point something, or they're going to say 40, or they're going to say 41. They're never going to say 40.7. And the second thing is to avoid counterfeiting. Like, they avoid giving out specific dimensions, like the dial is this much, and the bezel is this wide, and the watch is this tall, and the lug to lug is this much, and the interhorn is this much, because then they just make it super easy for clone manufacturers to get the right dimensions. But when they say this is 40, you guess that you can bet that a lot of douchebag clone makers, they go and they make a 41, and then it looks ridiculously large by comparison. I have seen some super clone Daytonas and super clone Datejust 41s and super clone, and you can tell that it's a super clone just based on the size, because a Daytona is, guess what, a Daytona is also not 40 millimeters, and the Datejust 41 I just told you is not 40 millimeters or 41, it's 38 point something. So you can see it from like 6 feet away. You can say, oh, that's not a real Datejust because it's just too big. Same with almost everything. So I think these are the two main reasons why Rolex does this, why they give out a little bit. And there's a third reason, but this is just, a speculation at this point. They like to give out measurements of how a watch feels, not how a watch is actually when you measure it with the calipers. Because if you've seen my other video, you've seen a video where I compared this watch, the Rolex Explorer, with the Submariner. The Submariner is listed as 41, but it's actually 40.5 millimeters. So it's 40. Let's just call it what it is. It's 40. It's always been 40, and it's in recent times, and it's 40. And this watch wears very similarly, has a similar wrist presence, has a similar wrist stance. Like, they are basically two interpretations of the same watch, and you can check out that video and you can see where I actually say that these are basically the same watch. And if anything, because this has a bigger dial, in certain angles and in certain scenarios, you might even think that this one is a little bit bigger. So this is, I think, the third reason why Rolex says Explorer 40. It's because it wears like a 40 millimeter watch. It wears like the Submariner, and the Submariner is 40. There are multiple things that contribute to that. The solid bracelet, the fact that the bracelet is 21. Just the solid construction, everything, the bigger crown. There are ample reasons why they feel the same. So I think this is another reason why they say that. They want to give not the most mathematically and scientifically accurate measurement, but they want to give the most accurate measurement in terms of feeling. But again, all these three are just hypotheses. I've never talked to anyone from Rolex to validate these claims, but this is what I believe anyway. I believe that they do this to fake out the fakers and to mislead them into creating bigger watches, but they also do this because this is effectively how the watch feels, right? Stay tuned. The next video, I'm going to compare these two watches beyond the actual dimensions. I'll compare them in terms of how they feel on the wrist, the sensation that they give you, and which one is more comfortable. And if you want to see that comparison, stay tuned for the next video.